Hello everyone, let's discuss the China-US trade negotiations. No new agreement emerged, but US officials remain optimistic. Meanwhile, US media mocks the EU, claiming it lacks China's strong retaliatory capabilities. US government advisors also dismissed the EU, stating it had already surrendered to Trump. The latest China-US trade talks in Sweden concluded without a new agreement, yet both sides extended the tariff truce by 90 days. US officials continue to speak positively, asserting the meeting was constructive. This shows that the US is unwilling to offend China. After the meeting, US Treasury Secretary Bessent held a press conference. I spent time listening to his entire briefing. Although I don't quite agree with his views, it's worth understanding his logic. There are a few key points. First, ensuring the supply of rare earths. Bessent said that the main purpose of their visit was to make sure that the agreement reached at the London meeting to accelerate the flow of rare earth magnets to the US can be implemented on schedule. They discussed securing the US supply chain. He said the two major economies are at the negotiating table. They reiterated to Chinese representatives that the US doesn't want to decouple, they just need to reduce risks in certain areas, such as strategic industries, rare earths, semiconductors, or even pharmaceuticals. The second point is seeking so-called US-China trade balance. Bessent said that both sides discussed how they could work together to achieve a balanced US-China relationship. Bessent mentioned that another negotiator, Ambassador Greer, brought up a very good point at the meeting. He said that for decades, the US trade system has sacrificed manufacturing in exchange for being able to sell American agricultural products or energy. Now, under President Trump's leadership, as you can see in the agreements between the US and Japan and Europe, there are new provisions. The US can now have the best of both worlds. They can bring manufacturing back to America, while at the same time achieving large-scale purchases of American products. Third, you expressed your views on the Chinese economy. Bessent said they would provide a very detailed report on the US economy, and also expressed their concerns about China's global overcapacity. Fourth, regarding oil sanctions on Venezuela, they voiced concerns about China buying Iranian oil, saying that China has purchased about 90% of Iran's oil. They also expressed regret, believing that China sold about $15 billion worth of dual-use goods to Russia. However, he emphasized that the overall atmosphere of the meeting was very constructive. Bessent seemed reluctant to talk too much about these controversial topics and didn't want to highlight the differences between the two sides. Later, during the Q&A session, reporters pressed Bessent, asking what he thought was the biggest concession China made in these negotiations. Bessent said he wanted to reiterate that China is the most unbalanced modern economy, and that China accounts for a significant share globally. China's trade current account surplus is 30% of $100 billion, accounting for 2% of global GDP. This is unprecedented, something that hasn't happened since the British Empire in the 1870s. This situation is unsustainable. He said President Trump started talking about the China issue very early on. In the early 2000s, when China joined the WTO, the US experienced the China shock. As for Europe's business model, it really is a very unique model. It relies on cheap Russian energy and an undervalued exchange rate, because the economic situation in southern European countries drags down the overall value of the euro. Then Europe can sell its goods to China. But now, China is using a kind of judo-style counterattack against this European model. China used the cover of the COVID-19 pandemic to boost its export capacity instead of increasing domestic consumption, and they've also made significant improvements at the high end of the value chain. So, over time, we've seen these changes. Person said he expects that in the future, other developed economies will also start to raise tariff barriers against China. The reporter then pressed Person on how he deals with competition from China. Person said that President Trump's tariff policies were partly implemented to address competition from China. Based on current data estimates, this year the annual trade between the US and China is expected to decrease by at least $50 billion, so there has already been some progress. Person also mentioned using Section 323 of the trade law, attempting to bring pharmaceutical or semiconductor manufacturing back to the US, starting with lower tariffs domestically, but then raising tariffs at a certain stage later on. But these are global measures, not targeted at China, nor at any specific country, and no country has managed to secure exceptions or exemptions from the US. Regarding the issue of Russian oil, the US has threatened to impose a 100% tariff on countries that buy Russian oil. When asked by the reporter what message China has conveyed about Russian oil, Person said that anyone purchasing sanctioned Russian oil should be prepared for the consequences. The reporter pressed further, asking how China responded to that warning. Person gave a rather strange answer, saying that the Chinese are very serious about their sovereignty, and that the US doesn't want to interfere with their sovereignty, so they are willing to pay the 100% tariff. After watching Person's press conference, what conclusions can we draw? First, the US has its own twisted logic. The US gave up on manufacturing to pursue more lucrative sectors like services and finance, and now claims that its manufacturing sector has been sacrificed, so everyone should buy its agricultural products and energy. It sounds righteous, but in reality, it's a distortion of the facts. Second, China has vigorously developed its manufacturing industry and achieved success, accounting for 30% of global manufacturing. The US says China is the most unbalanced modern economy, but if we look at the US, its financial sector is extremely successful. The US stock market accounts for 40 to 45% of the total global market capitalization. The US Treasury market is the largest in the world, making up nearly 40% of all outstanding government bonds globally. By the US's own logic, the US is actually the most unbalanced modern economy. When will the US reduce its share in finance to lessen the financial imbalance between itself and other countries? Third, in the China-US negotiations, whether it's about so-called trade rebalancing or the issue of China buying oil from Russia and Iran, if China sticks to its position and doesn't make major concessions, it seems that the US, especially under Biden, intends to downplay these differences. It's clear that Trump wanted to improve relations with China, so he tried to set aside these disagreements as much as possible as a precondition for his visit. Also, we can look at how the US domestic audience is responding to the US-Europe trade agreement. The US National Security Council reflected on this, with senior advisor to Trump, Gorka, saying that the EU has already knelt down and surrendered to Trump. What did Gorka say? He said that the new US-EU trade agreement will not only bring the US unprecedented tariff revenue, but also signifies that the US has achieved victory in the geopolitical game against the EU. This is a historic moment. He said that even people who have known President Trump for 10 years can hardly believe that the entire EU would surrender to the America First policy. The EU is now basically saying openly, all right, we won't ride on America's coattails anymore. We won't take advantage of the global trade system anymore. President Trump, you've won. The EU is willing to accept a 15% tariff. Gorka said it was precisely Trump's tariff policy that forced the EU to no longer take for granted America's economic leadership. The latest trade victory also proves the legitimacy of the America First policy. Not only are Trump's advisors mocking the EU, but American media figures are laughing as well. EMU's commentator Lizzie responded on television to the US-EU trade agreement, saying that Trump is not seeking fleeting fame in Europe. What he's after is a long-term victory, and he's actually achieved it. Europeans are extremely angry about this. Europe is filled with words like surrender and capitulation, because their EU gave in at the negotiating table. What did the EU get out of this? That's a good question. European cars won't be hit with a 25% tariff by the US. The overall tariff level on European goods entering the US has indeed been lowered. But the one who really scored a huge victory is Trump. You know, there's a big difference between the EU and China. The situation with China is tricky, because China has resources like rare earths that the US needs, but Europe has nothing. Even though they look down on Trump, they're also angry at NATO, because NATO is pushing them to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP. This points directly to the fact that, under such intense pressure from the US, after months of tough negotiations, the EU still doesn't even know what they can negotiate for. What do they actually have? The EU, this bloc of 27 countries, has seen almost no economic growth over the past 30 years, while the US has been developing rapidly. The EU has done nothing in the field of artificial intelligence, and there's been no progress in energy either. Their economy is in trouble, so he's very pleased that this happened at this time, because the EU was forced to sign the treaty. You know, people think that European leaders are acting tough towards Trump, but in reality, it's all just for show. Every European leader tries to look tough by standing up to Trump, hoping to win political points at home by currying favor with Europeans. But in the end, they still have to sit down and sign the deal. There's no other way to sum it up. First of all, without a doubt, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has signed a humiliating and disgraceful treaty. Americans don't mind treating the EU as a joke. An American presidential advisor can just say the EU has already knelt and surrendered to Trump. If it were India, for example, even if you talked about Indian terrorism, Prime Minister Modi wouldn't just take it, he'd argue back. But the EU acts like nothing happened, proving they know deep down they have no choice but to submit. Second, the Fox News commentator hit the nail on the head. The EU's economy hasn't grown in 30 years. They can't develop large AI models, produce rare earth magnets, or simply don't have the means. Unlike China, they can't stand up to the US and act tough. It's all for show. Third, China is different. They have the capital to stand firm, so they're not afraid to push back against the US. That's why, in the future, Europe won't have a say in global affairs. Also, regarding the current situation, let's discuss the attempt to cut off China's supply chain. What about Trump being exposed for trade with Myanmar? Rare earth experts criticized the US government, saying they've completely lost it. What they're doing won't succeed. If you'd like more of my commentary, subscribe and watch on my channel.